Tonight, a man will realize that the woman he cast aside like trash now stands at the pinnacle of power he could never have reached. Kyle Mercer, who divorced his wife because he believed she was holding him back, is about to walk into the room and discover the harsh truth. His ex-wife is not only a long-lost descendant of the billionaire Blackthorne family, but also the wife of the most feared mafia boss on the East Coast. This is a story about the price of ambition, the fall of arrogance, and the pain of realizing you've lost it all too soon. Watch until the end, and comment where you're watching to let me know how far this story has progressed. Now, let's begin. Rain hammered Manhattan like bullets against armor, each drop exploding on concrete and steel as Kyle Mercer stepped out of the black town car onto the red carpet stretching toward the Blackthorne Legacy Gala. The kind of rain that soaked through expensive fabric and ruined $2,000 shoes, but Kyle didn't care. Tonight was everything. Tonight was validation. Tonight was the moment he stopped being the poor kid from Newark who clawed his way into boardrooms where people spoke in inherited confidence and old money whispers. He'd been preparing for this night for 3 years. Beside him, Vivienne Laurent emerged from the car in a silver gown that caught every camera flash like shattered glass. She moved with the calculated grace of someone who'd been born into wealth and trained to weaponize beauty. Her hand rested on his arm, not affectionately, but proprietarily, like a flag planted on conquered territory. "Smile," she murmured through perfect teeth. "You look like you're about to murder someone." "I'm focused." "You're sweating." He was. Despite the cold rain, despite the November chill cutting through his tuxedo, Kyle could feel moisture gathering at his temples, sliding down his spine. Fear and anticipation mixing into something that tasted like copper on his tongue. The photographers shouted his name, not because they knew who he was, not yet, but because Vivienne Laurent photographed well, and anyone standing next to her became temporarily worth documenting. Kyle forced his expression into something resembling confidence and guided her toward the entrance, past the velvet ropes and security personnel wearing earpieces and dead eyes. The Blackthorne estate rose before them like a monument to American aristocracy. Marble columns, gold fixtures, windows so tall they seemed designed to make anyone standing beneath them feel appropriately small. This wasn't just wealth. This was legacy, the kind of power that got passed down through bloodlines and trust funds that had been accumulating interest since before the Civil War. Kyle had been chasing this world his entire adult life. Inside, the entrance hall opened into a space that could have swallowed his childhood apartment 10 times over. Crystal chandeliers hung like frozen explosions of light. A string quartet played something classical and mournful in the corner. Waiters in white gloves circulated with champagne and hors d'oeuvres that probably cost more per bite than Kyle used to spend on groceries in a week. He took it all in, the oil paintings, the imported marble, the casual way these people wore wealth like a second skin, and felt something hard and hungry tighten in his chest. This should be mine. This will be mine. Champagne? Vivienne plucked 2 glasses from a passing tray without waiting for an answer. She handed him one, her eyes already scanning the room, cataloging who was here, who mattered, who was worth approaching. She operated like a predator in designer clothing. It was one of the things Kyle had initially found attractive about her. Now it just reminded him that neither of them was here for love. "Victor Blackthorne is near the East Gallery," she said quietly. "I saw him 15 minutes ago talking to Senator Whitmore. If you're going to make your pitch, do it before the formal dinner starts. Once he sits down, you won't get another chance." Kyle nodded, his jaw tight. The pitch. The investment partnership. The reason he'd spent the last 2 years positioning himself, networking, burning through capital and connections to get into rooms with people who could make or break empires with a signature. Victor Blackthorne was the patriarch, the king, the man whose approval could transform Kyle from a scrappy hedge fund manager into a legitimate player in the world of high finance. And tonight, Victor had agreed to a private meeting. "Stay visible," Kyle told Vivienne. "Make sure people see you talking to the right names. We need social proof." She smiled, a cold, precise expression that didn't reach her eyes. "I know how to work a room, darling. Try not to fuck this up." Then she was gone, gliding toward a cluster of older women dripping in jewelry and judgment. Kyle drained his champagne in one swallow and moved deeper into the gala, past conversations about summer homes in the Hamptons and winter escapes to Aspen, past people who'd never worked a real day in their lives discussing market fluctuations like abstract art. He recognized faces from Forbes covers, from financial news segments, from the kinds of parties he used to watch from the outside. Now, he was inside, and he was drowning. The East Gallery was smaller, more intimate, walls lined with what were probably priceless paintings Kyle couldn't name. Victor Blackthorne stood near a window overlooking the gardens, his profile sharp against the rain-streaked glass. Late 60s, silver hair, a posture that suggested he'd never doubted his place in the world for a single second. Kyle approached, his heart hammering against his ribs. "Mr. Blackthorne." Victor turned slowly, his expression neutral but his eyes sharp, assessing. "Mr. Mercer, punctual. That's becoming rare these days." "Time is the only resource we can't buy more of," Kyle said, extending his hand. Victor's handshake was brief, perfunctory. "Let's walk." They moved through the gallery, past Renaissance-era portraits and landscapes that probably cost more than most people's houses. Kyle launched into his pitch, the investment partnership, the growth projections, the market opportunities he'd identified. He'd practiced this 1,000 times, every word calibrated, every statistic memorized, every angle calculated to appeal to someone like Victor Blackthorne. But as he talked, he noticed Victor's expression growing distant, not bored, worse than bored, unimpressed. "Mr. Mercer," Victor interrupted, his tone polite but final. "I appreciate your enthusiasm, truly, but I'm going to be direct with you because anything else would waste both our time." Kyle's stomach dropped. "I'm not interested in your proposal." The words landed like a physical blow. Kyle felt his carefully constructed composure beginning to crack. "Sir, if you'd just look at the numbers." "It's not about numbers." Victor's voice remained calm, almost gentle in its brutality. "You're talented, clearly ambitious, but you're also exactly the kind of man I've spent my life avoiding in business." "What does that mean?" "It means you're hungry in a way that makes you dangerous. Not to others, to yourself. You'll make aggressive bets, burn bridges, sacrifice relationships for short-term gains. I've seen 100 men like you, Mr. Mercer. Most of them end up broke or in prison by 50. Kyle's face flushed hot. "You don't know me. I know your type." Victor's gaze was steady, almost pitying. "You're trying so hard to become someone you're not that you can't see who you actually are. And that's a liability I won't invest in." "This is about bloodline, isn't it?" Kyle's voice came out harsher than he intended. "Because I didn't inherit my start. Because I had to build everything from nothing." "No." Victor's expression didn't change. "It's about character, and yours is still under construction." The dismissal was surgical. Complete. Victor offered a polite nod and walked away, leaving Kyle standing alone in the gallery surrounded by painted faces from centuries past, all of them seeming to stare down at him with the same indifferent judgment. Kyle stood frozen, his mind struggling to process what had just happened. 3 years. 3 years of networking, positioning, sacrificing, climbing, all of it leading to this moment, and it was over in less than 5 minutes. He became aware of his breathing, too fast, too shallow. His hands were shaking. The carefully constructed confidence he'd worn like armor was disintegrating, leaving behind something raw and humiliated. He needed to leave. Needed to get out before someone saw him like this, before Vivian found him and realized he'd failed. Kyle turned and walked back toward the main hall, his vision tunneling, the classical music and polite laughter becoming a distant roar in his ears. He grabbed another glass of champagne from a passing waiter and downed it without tasting it, then grabbed another. "Get out. Just get to the car, regroup, figure out what comes next." But as he pushed through the crowd toward the exit, the room suddenly shifted. Conversations quieted. Heads turned. The string quartet transitioned into something slower, more dramatic. Kyle looked up. At the top of the grand staircase, a woman was descending. She moved like gravity had different rules for her, slow, deliberate, commanding attention without demanding it. Black velvet gown that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Dark hair swept back to expose a face Kale recognized with the kind of shock that stops time. Serafina, his ex-wife, The woman he'd divorced 8 months ago because she'd been holding him back from his ambitions. The quiet bookstore clerk who'd never understood why his career mattered more than their marriage. The person he'd convinced himself was too small for the life he was trying to build. But this wasn't that woman. This woman moved through the room like she owned it, like every person here existed in her orbit. Her expression was composed, unreadable, the face of someone who'd learned to wear power like a second skin. And beside her, moving with the predatory confidence of a jungle cat in formal wear, was a man Kyle recognized from news reports and whispered rumors. Roman Volkov. The name alone carried weight in New York. Mafia sovereign, they called him. The kind of man who controlled territories and industries through a combination of legitimate business and operations that happened in shadows where cameras didn't reach. He was rumored to be connected to politicians, judges, police commissioners. The kind of power that didn't show up on Forbes lists because it operated outside any system designed to measure it. And he was walking beside Serafina like she belonged to him. Cale felt something cold and sharp slide between his ribs. No. This didn't make sense. Serafina was nobody. A girl who'd worked in a bookstore in Brooklyn, who'd read novels and drank cheap wine, and never seemed to want anything more than a quiet life. She'd been the opposite of ambition, the opposite of power. What the fuck was happening? The crowd parted as Serafina and Roman reached the bottom of the stairs. People approached them with the kind of deference usually reserved for heads of state. Handshakes, air kisses, careful, respectful distance. Then Victor Blackthorne stepped forward and embraced Serafina like family. Kale's drink slipped from his fingers, champagne and shattered glass exploding at his feet. A few people nearby turned to look, then quickly looked away, dismissing him as just another clumsy guest. But Kale couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Victor raised his hand, and the room fell silent. "Thank you all for being here tonight," Victor's voice carried across the hall with practiced authority. "Most of you know this gala celebrates the Blackthorne legacy. What you don't know is that tonight marks a very special reunion." He placed his hand on Serafina's shoulder. 28 years ago, my daughter and her husband died in a car accident. I thought I'd lost everything. But recently, through the work of some very dedicated investigators, I discovered that their daughter survived. She was raised by a foster family who never knew her true identity. Cale felt the floor tilting beneath him. "Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to introduce you to my granddaughter, Serafina Vale Blackthorne." The room erupted in polite applause and shocked murmurs. And then Victor added, almost as an afterthought, "And her husband, Roman Volkov." The words detonated in Kale's skull like a grenade. Husband. He stared at Serafina across the room, trying to reconcile the woman he'd known, the quiet, unambitious girl who'd cried when he'd asked for the divorce, with this creature standing in the center of power wearing it like birthright. Her eyes swept across the crowd and found his. For one moment, they locked gazes. She didn't smile, didn't frown. Her expression remained perfectly neutral, as if she was looking at a stranger she vaguely recognized but couldn't quite place. Then her attention moved on, dismissing him, erasing him, like he'd never existed at all. Cale felt something break inside his chest, not his heart, because this wasn't heartbreak. This was something worse. This was the destruction of his entire understanding of reality. The woman he'd discarded because she wasn't useful to his ambitions had been secretly sitting on an inheritance worth hundreds of millions, had been connected to one of the most powerful families in America, had married one of the most dangerous men on the eastern seaboard, and she'd never told him. She'd let him leave, let him divorce her, let him walk away thinking he was trading up, moving toward something bigger and better. When all along, she'd been the thing he was chasing. Vivian appeared at his elbow, her face tight with poorly concealed fury. "Did you know about this?" "No." The word came out strangled. "That's your ex-wife, the nobody you divorced, the clerk." "Yes. She's a Blackthorne." Vivian's voice was sharp enough to cut glass. "She's connected to Roman Volkov. Do you have any idea what this makes you look like? What this makes US look like?" Cale couldn't answer. He was still staring at Serafina, watching her move through the room accepting congratulations, her hand resting on Roman's arm with casual ownership. "We need to leave," Vivian hissed. "Now, before anyone connects you to her publicly. This is a disaster." But Kael didn't move, because somewhere beneath the shock and humiliation, something else was beginning to rise. Something hot and ugly and familiar. Rage. She'd lied to him. For their entire marriage, Serafina had been sitting on this secret, pretending to be powerless while knowing exactly what she was. She'd watched him struggle, watched him sacrifice everything for his ambitions, and never once offered to help, never once told him the truth. And now she was standing in the center of the world he'd been trying so desperately to enter, wearing it like it had always belonged to her. Kael. Vivian's grip on his arm tightened. We're leaving. He let her pull him toward the exit, past the crowds and cameras, back into the rain that was now falling in sheets. The town car was waiting, and Kael collapsed into the leather seats, his tuxedo soaked, his mind spinning. Vivian climbed in beside him, already on her phone, probably doing damage control with her social circle. But Kael wasn't thinking about damage control. He was thinking about Serafina, about the quiet nights in their apartment when she'd read books while he worked on his laptop, building his future, about the way she'd smiled when he'd talked about his dreams, about how she'd never asked for anything except his time, his attention, his love, things he'd been too busy to give, and now she had everything, everything he wanted, everything he'd sacrificed her to obtain. The car pulled away from the Blackthorn estate, and Kael watched through the rain-streaked window as the lit mansion grew smaller in the distance. His phone buzzed. A text from his business partner, Marcus. Just saw the announcement. Your ex-wife is a Blackthorn? What the fuck, man? Call me immediately. Then another text. From an investor. Need to discuss some concerns about our partnership. Available tomorrow? Then another, and another. The fallout was already beginning. By morning, Kael knew, everyone in New York's financial world would know the story. The man who divorced a hidden heiress before she inherited an empire. The fool who threw away a winning lottery ticket because it looked too plain. He'd become a joke, a cautionary tale. The embodiment of ambition destroying itself. Vivian finally looked up from her phone. I'm going to need some distance from you for a while. Until this settles. What? You're about to become toxic, Kael. I can't afford to be associated with this narrative. It makes me look like an idiot for being with you. So you're just... what? Done? She smiled, but there was no warmth in it. I'm strategic. You should understand that better than anyone. The car stopped outside Vivian's apartment building. She climbed out without another word, leaving Kael alone in the back seat, soaked and shaking and trying to understand how his entire life had collapsed in less than 2 hours. His phone continued buzzing. More messages, more concern, more people distancing themselves from the disaster he'd become. Kael closed his eyes and saw Serafina's face again. That moment when she'd looked at him across the ballroom with perfect indifference. Like he was nothing. Like he'd always been nothing. And somewhere in the dark corners of his mind, a question began forming. Had she planned this? Had Serafina known all along who she was? Had she been playing him from the very beginning? Let him divorce her so she could emerge clean, sympathetic, powerful? The thought took root like poison. Because if that was true, if she'd manipulated him, used him, discarded him, then this wasn't just humiliation. This was war, and Kael Mercer had never walked away from a fight in his life. The car pulled up to his apartment building in Midtown. Kael climbed out into the rain, tilted his face toward the sky, and let the water wash over him until he couldn't tell the difference between rain and the tears of rage gathering in his eyes. Tomorrow, he decided, he would start looking for answers. He would find out exactly when Serafina had discovered her identity. Exactly when she'd reconnected with the Blackthorns. Exactly how long she'd been lying to him. And then he would decide what to do with that information. Behind him, the Manhattan skyline blazed with light despite the storm. Indifferent to his pain, indifferent to his fury, indifferent to the fact that somewhere in one of those towers, the woman he'd thrown away was probably celebrating her victory. Kael walked inside, his expensive shoes squelching against marble floors, and knew with absolute certainty that his life had just divided into before and after. Before the gala, when he'd believed he was climbing toward power. After the gala, when he'd discovered that power had been sleeping beside him all along, and he'd been too blind to see it. The elevator doors closed, and Kyle stared at his reflection in the polished metal. Soaked, disheveled, destroyed, but not defeated. Not yet. Because if Serafina thought she could erase him with a single dismissive glance, she was about to learn something important about the man she'd married and discarded. Kyle Mercer didn't know how to accept loss. He only knew how to burn everything down until someone declared him the winner. And if he was going down, he'd make damn sure she went down with him. Kyle didn't sleep. He sat in his apartment as dawn broke over Manhattan, still wearing the damp tuxedo from the night before, staring at his laptop screen with eyes that burned from exhaustion and rage. Coffee had gone cold in the cup beside him 3 hours ago. His phone lay face down on the desk, silenced after the 100th message had come through. The internet had already made him famous. Not the kind of famous he'd been chasing, the other kind. Financial blogs had picked up the story by 3 in the morning. Hedge fund manager divorces wife. Months before she inherits Blackthorn fortune. The headlines wrote themselves. Twitter was having a field day. Someone had already created a meme using his LinkedIn photo with the caption, "How to Fumble a Billionaire Heiress, a Masterclass." Kale scrolled through article after article, each one twisting the knife deeper. But he wasn't looking at the headlines anymore. He was looking at the timeline. His fingers moved across the keyboard with mechanical precision, pulling up every piece of information he could find about Serafina's reconnection with the Blackthorn family. Public records, society page mentions, charity gala appearances from the last 6 months. And there it was. Serafina had first appeared at a Blackthorn Foundation event 9 months ago, a small museum fundraiser. Nothing major. But she'd been there, photographed shaking hands with Victor Blackthorn, both of them smiling like they'd known each other for years. 9 months ago, 1 month before Kyle had asked for the divorce, his hands froze on the keyboard. She'd known. While they were still married, while she was still sleeping in their bed and making breakfast in their tiny kitchen, Serafina had already been introduced to her grandfather, had already been welcomed into the family, had already begun the process of claiming her inheritance, and she'd never said a word. Kale pushed back from the desk so hard his chair hit the wall. His breathing came in sharp, shallow gasps. The apartment suddenly felt too small, the walls pressing in, the air too thick to breathe. She'd played him. Let him think he was making the decision to leave. Let him believe he was choosing ambition over a mediocre marriage, when all along she'd been sitting on a fortune that would have solved every problem he'd been trying to claw his way out of. His phone buzzed again. He grabbed it, saw Marcus's name, and answered. "Where the fuck have you been?" Marcus's voice came through tight with barely controlled panic. "I've been calling you for 6 hours." "I've been busy." "Busy? Kyle, our investors are losing their minds. Chen called me at 4 in the morning asking if you'd deliberately hidden your connection to the Blackthorns. Patterson wants an emergency meeting. The optics on this are—" "I didn't know." Kale's voice came out flat. "I had no idea who she was." "That somehow makes it worse." Marcus exhaled sharply. "You divorced a Blackthorn and didn't even know it. What does that say about your due diligence, about your judgment? It says she lied to me. No one's going to care about that. They're going to care that you look like an idiot. And idiots don't get investments, Kale. They get laughed out of boardrooms." Kale closed his eyes, pressing his palm against his forehead. "What do you need from me?" "Damage control. A statement. Something that makes this look less catastrophic than it appears." "Like what?" "I don't know. Say it was an amicable divorce. Say you're happy for her. Say anything except what you're probably actually feeling." The line went quiet for a moment. "What am I actually feeling, Marcus? Like you want to burn the world down." Marcus's tone softened slightly. "But you can't. Not if you want to salvage your career. So whatever you're thinking about doing right now, don't." Kyle hung up without responding. He stood in the center of his living room, surrounded by the trappings of the life he'd built. Modern furniture. Expensive art he'd bought because it looked like success. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking a city that suddenly felt hostile. Everything he'd worked for was collapsing, and Serafina was the reason. His phone buzzed again. This time, an unknown number. Kyle stared at it for 3 rings before answering. "Mr. Mercer?" The voice was male, calm, professional. "My name is Anton. I work for Mr. Volkov. He'd like to meet with you." Kale's grip tightened on the phone. When? Now. A car is waiting outside your building. And if I refuse? Mr. Volkov strongly suggests you don't. The line went dead. Kyle looked down at himself, still wearing the wrinkled tuxedo, his shirt untucked, bow tie hanging loose around his neck. He looked like exactly what he was, a man who'd been destroyed in a single evening and hadn't recovered. Good. Let Roman Volkov see what his wife had done. The black SUV was idling at the curb when Kyle stepped outside, the morning sun barely cutting through the gray clouds hanging over Manhattan. Two men in dark suits stood beside it, not obviously armed, but carrying themselves with the kind of readiness that suggested violence was always an option. No one spoke as Kyle climbed into the back seat. The city slid past the tinted windows as they drove, early commuters hurrying toward subway stations, food carts opening for business, the machinery of New York grinding forward regardless of individual catastrophes. They headed south, away from Midtown, toward the waterfront warehouses near the Brooklyn Navy Yard. The kind of place where people had conversations they didn't want recorded. The SUV pulled into an abandoned loading dock, the building around them skeletal and forgotten. Inside, industrial lights hung from chains, casting harsh shadows across concrete floors stained with decades of oil and rust. Roman Volkov stood in the center of the space like a king in his throne room. He was younger than Kyle had expected, maybe early 40s, dark hair swept back, wearing a suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. But it wasn't the clothes that commanded attention. It was the way he inhabited space, the way the 6 men positioned around the warehouse's perimeter all oriented toward him like planets around a sun. This was power without performance, the kind that didn't need to announce itself. Mr. Mercer. Roman's accent carried traces of Eastern Europe beneath polished American English. Thank you for coming. Didn't realize I had a choice. Roman smiled slightly. You always have choices. The consequences simply vary. Kyle forced himself to meet Roman's gaze directly. What do you want? To have a conversation, man to man. Roman gestured to a metal folding chair. Sit. I'll stand. Sit. The word carried no threat, no raised voice, just absolute certainty that it would be obeyed. Kale sat. Roman remained standing, hands clasped behind his back, studying Kyle with the clinical interest of someone examining an insect under glass. You're wondering why you're here, Roman said. You think perhaps I've brought you to this place to hurt you, to punish you for being married to my wife before I was. The thought crossed my mind. I'm not that petty. Roman began walking in a slow circle around Kyle's chair. But I am protective. Serafina is not just my wife, she's my partner, my equal, and when someone causes her pain, I take that very personally. I didn't... You divorced her. Roman's voice remained conversational. 8 months ago. You told her she was holding you back from your ambitions, that you needed someone who understood the kind of life you were trying to build. Do you remember saying that? Kale's jaw tightened. Yes. She cried for 3 days. Did you know that? After you left, she barely ate, barely spoke. She genuinely believed she'd failed you somehow. Roman stopped directly in front of Kyle. That's the woman I met 6 months ago, broken because of you. I didn't know who she was. No, you didn't, because she chose not to tell you. Roman leaned back against a concrete pillar. Do you know why? Why don't you tell me? Because she knew exactly what kind of man you were becoming. She watched you change, month by month, turning into someone who valued connections over character, who saw relationships as transactions, who would climb over anyone, including her, to reach the next rung. The words landed like physical blows because they were true. So when she discovered her identity, Roman continued, when Victor's investigators found her and explained everything, she made a choice. She could tell you and risk having you use her family as leverage, or she could stay quiet and see if you'd choose her without knowing what she was worth. That's manipulation. That's self-preservation. Roman's expression didn't change, and you failed the test spectacularly. Kale stood, his fists clenched. So what now? You brought me here to rub it in? To make sure I know how badly I fucked up? No. Roman pushed off from the pillar. I brought you here to give you a choice. He reached into his jacket and pulled out an envelope. Crisp, white, expensive paper. Inside this envelope is a check for $2 million. Also a legal document that, when signed, requires you to never speak Serafina's name publicly again. Never contact her. Never attempt to use your former connection to her for personal gain. You take this money, leave New York, and rebuild your life somewhere else. Roman held out the envelope. Or? Kael asked. Kael. Or you refuse, and I make absolutely certain that every door in this city closes in your face. Every investor, every partnership, every opportunity, gone. I won't touch you physically. I don't need to. I'll simply make you irrelevant. Roman's smile was cold, and we both know that's worse than death for someone like you. Kael stared at the envelope. $2 million. An escape. A way out. His pride screamed at him to refuse. His survival instinct whispered that he should take it and run. I need time to think. You have until sunset. Roman set the envelope on the chair. Choose wisely, Mr. Mercer. This is the only mercy you're going to receive. The meeting was over. The men by the perimeter moved forward, a silent signal that Kael was being dismissed. He walked back to the SUV on legs that felt like they belonged to someone else, climbed inside, and let them drive him back to his apartment in silence. The envelope sat on his kitchen counter for 3 hours while Kael paced, drank coffee that had gone cold, and tried to think through the impossible choice Roman had given him. $2 million wasn't nothing. It was enough to start over, maybe move to Chicago or Los Angeles, build something new away from the wreckage of his New York reputation. But it would also mean admitting defeat, admitting that Serafina had won, that she'd played him perfectly and walked away with everything while he slunk off into exile with a consolation prize. His phone rang, a number he didn't recognize. Kael answered without speaking. Mr. Mercer? This is Vivian. What do you want? To meet. I have information you need to see. I'm not interested in... It's about Serafina. About when she really discovered her identity. Vivian's voice dropped lower. And I promise you, it's not what she's been telling people. Kael's pulse quickened. Where? The coffee shop on Lexington. 1 hour. She hung up. Kael stared at his reflection in the darkened screen of his phone, seeing a man he barely recognized. Exhausted, desperate, backed into a corner, but still fighting. He grabbed his jacket and headed for the door, leaving Roman's envelope unopened on the counter. The coffee shop was deliberately anonymous. Corporate chain, forgettable decor, the kind of place where people had conversations they didn't want remembered. Vivian sat in the back corner, wearing oversized sunglasses despite the overcast day, her blonde hair pulled back in a severe ponytail. She looked up as Kael approached, her expression unreadable. You look like shit, she said. Thanks. Kael dropped into the chair across from her. What's this about? Vivian slid a manila folder across the table. I have a friend who works in private investigations, specializes in background checks for high net worth individuals. I asked him to look into Serafina's timeline. Kael opened the folder. Inside were printed documents, emails, photographs, financial records. Look at the dates, Vivian said quietly. Kael's eyes scanned the papers. An email from Victor Blackthorne's office to Serafina dated 14 months ago. A wire transfer for $50,000, 10 months ago. Photographs of Serafina having lunch with Victor at an exclusive Manhattan restaurant, 11 months ago. 11 months. They'd still been married 11 months ago. She's been lying, Vivian said, about when she reconnected with the family, about how long she's known, the timeline she's been feeding people, that she only discovered her identity after the divorce. It's complete bullshit. Kael felt something hot and acidic rising in his throat. She knew the whole time. Not the whole time, but close enough. She was already building her relationship with Victor while you two were still together. While you were killing yourself trying to network your way into rooms with these people, she was having private dinners with the patriarch. Why didn't she tell me? Because she was testing you. Vivian's voice carried bitter satisfaction. Seeing if you'd love her without knowing what she was worth. And when you failed, she let you go and played the victim. Poor abandoned Serafina, so heartbroken. Meanwhile, she was positioning herself to inherit everything. Kael's hands were shaking as he closed the folder. Where did you get this? Does it matter? It might. Vivian leaned back, crossing her arms. Let's just say there are people in Victor's organization who don't love the idea of a suddenly discovered granddaughter swooping in to claim a fortune. People who think traditional succession should be honored. People who might benefit from Serafina's image taking a hit. You're working with them. I'm working for myself. Vivian's smile was sharp. But we have aligned interests right now. They want her brought down a peg, and you want revenge. So here we are. Kyle stared at the folder, his mind racing. This was ammunition, proof that Serafina had manipulated the narrative, that she wasn't the innocent victim everyone believed her to be. What do you want me to do with this? Whatever you want. Vivian stood, adjusting her sunglasses. But if I were you, I'd make sure people know the truth. That the poor, discarded wife story is a carefully constructed lie. That she played you and is playing everyone else. She walked away, leaving Kyle alone with the folder and a choice that suddenly felt much clearer. He could take Roman's money and disappear. Or he could fight back. Show the world who Serafina really was beneath the designer gowns and inherited power. Destroy the sympathetic narrative she'd built. Make sure everyone knew she was just as calculating and ruthless as any other person scrambling for power in this city. Kale pulled out his phone and began scrolling through his contacts. He still had connections. Financial journalists who owed him favors. Bloggers who would kill for an exclusive angle on the Blackthorn story. Social media influencers who specialized in exposing the hypocrisy of the wealthy elite. One phone call could start an avalanche. One leaked document could crack the foundation of Serafina's carefully constructed image. His finger hovered over the first contact. Marcus's voice echoed in his head. Whatever you're thinking about doing, don't. Roman's voice, choose wisely. This is the only mercy you're going to receive. And beneath both of those, a quieter voice. The part of him that remembered Serafina as she'd been in their early days together, laughing in their apartment, reading poetry aloud while he worked, looking at him like he was enough, exactly as he was. That woman had loved him. This woman, the one in the documents, having secret meetings with billionaires while pretending to be powerless. That woman had used him. Cale made the call. Hey, it's Cale Mercer. Yeah, I know what time it is. Listen, I've got a story for you about the Blackthorn heiress. And trust me, it's not what anyone thinks. The journalist on the other end practically salivated through the phone. I'm listening. Not over the phone. Meet me in an hour. I'll bring documents. Cale hung up and made 3 more calls, each conversation brief, each one setting a chain reaction in motion. By tomorrow morning, the narrative would shift. Serafina wouldn't be the tragic figure who'd been abandoned. She'd be the calculating manipulator who'd orchestrated her own victimhood. And Kyle would be the man who'd exposed her. He stood, tucking the folder under his arm, and walked out of the coffee shop into the gray afternoon light. Rain was threatening again, the sky heavy with unshed water. His phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. I'm hearing you're making some calls. Stop. Then another. This is your final warning. Cale deleted both messages and kept walking. He'd chosen his path. Now there was no turning back. That night, Kyle met with 4 different media contacts, each time spreading pieces of the story like poison through a water system. He was careful, strategic. He didn't present himself as vindictive, just as someone who wanted the truth to be known. She knew about her inheritance before we divorced, he told them, his voice heavy with manufactured hurt. She let me think I was making the choice to leave, but she'd already been meeting with her grandfather for months, already had access to wealth that would have solved every problem we were facing, and she said nothing. The journalists ate it up. By 2 a.m, the first articles started appearing online, carefully worded, suggesting rather than accusing, but damaging nonetheless. Questions arise about Blackthorn heiress timeline. Sources say Serafina Vale knew about identity before divorce. Was the Blackthorn reunion more calculated than we thought? Kyle sat in his apartment watching the stories multiply, feeling something dark and satisfying coil in his chest. This was power. Not the power of money or connections. The power of narrative destruction. His phone rang at 3:15 in the morning. He didn't recognize the number, but he answered anyway. Mr. Mercer. Roman's voice was perfectly calm. Too calm. I'm disappointed. Are you? I offered you a clean exit. a chance to walk away with dignity and resources to rebuild. You chose war instead. She lied to everyone. I'm just making sure people know the truth. The truth? Roman's laugh was soft and humorless. You have no idea what truth is. You have fragments of information you've arranged into a story that makes you feel better about your own failures. Those documents are real. The documents are real. Your interpretation of them is fantasy, but that doesn't matter anymore. You've made your choice. So what now? You're going to threaten me again? No. Roman's voice dropped even lower. Threats are for people who might still listen. You're past that point. So now I'm simply going to destroy you, professionally, socially, completely. And I'm going to make sure everyone knows exactly who started this war. The line went dead. Kyle sat in the darkness of his apartment, the glow of his laptop screen reflecting off windows that looked out over a sleeping city, and felt the first real stirrings of fear. Not fear of Roman. Fear that he'd just done something he couldn't undo. His phone buzzed with another message. This one from Marcus. What the fuck did you do? Call me now. Then another from an investor. Pulling out of the deal effective immediately. Don't contact me again. Then another and another. The avalanche he'd started was beginning to roll, but it was rolling in both directions, and Kyle was standing directly in its path. At 7 in the morning, exhausted and wired on coffee and adrenaline, Kyle received a message from a number he didn't recognize. Coffee shop on Mercer Street, noon, come alone, S. Serafina wanted to meet. Kyle stared at the message, his heart hammering against his ribs. Part of him wanted to refuse, to hide behind his leaked documents and media contacts and pretend he was winning this war. But another part, maybe the part that still remembered what it felt like to love her, needed to see her face, needed to hear her deny the accusations directly, needed to know if there was any truth left between them at all. He typed back, I'll be there. The coffee shop was small, tucked into a quiet Tribeca side street where tourists rarely ventured. Kyle arrived 10 minutes early, chose a table near the back, and waited. Serafina walked in at exactly noon. She wore simple clothes, jeans, a black sweater, minimal makeup. She looked like the woman he'd married, not the heiress from the gala, not the power player standing beside Roman Volkov, just Serafina. Except nothing about her was simple anymore. She sat down across from him without ordering anything, her hands folded on the table, her expression carefully neutral. You look tired, she said quietly. Haven't been sleeping. Neither have I. Not since the articles started appearing. They sat in silence for a moment, the cafe's background noise, coffee grinding, low conversations, street sounds filtering through the door, filling the space between them. Why did you do it? Serafina asked finally. Her voice was steady, but Kyle could hear something beneath it. Not anger. Something more like disappointment. Because you lied. I didn't lie. You hid the truth. Same thing. No. Serafina's eyes met his directly. Lying is actively deceiving someone. I simply chose not to share information that belonged to me. That wasn't yours to know. We were married. We were. Past tense. She leaned forward slightly. And do you know when I decided to keep my identity secret from you? When? The night you came home and told me about the Thompson deal. Remember that? Kale did. 8 months into their marriage. He'd landed a major investment from a wealthy family, and he'd been ecstatic. You were so proud, Serafina continued. You kept talking about how you'd impressed them, how they saw potential in you, and then you said something I've never forgotten. You said, this is what separates people like me from people like you, Sarah. I know how to make powerful people see value in me. The words hung in the air like an accusation. You looked at me like I was less than you, Serafina said quietly. Like my lack of ambition was a character flaw. Like my contentment with a simple life made me weak. And I realized in that moment that if I ever told you about my family, about what I was connected to, you wouldn't see me anymore. You'd just see opportunity. Kale felt something cold sliding down his spine. That's not... Yes, it is. Her voice remained calm, surgical. So when Victor's investigators found me 2 months later, I made a choice. I kept it secret to see if you would choose me without knowing what I was worth. And Kale, you didn't. The moment you thought I was holding you back, you left. You proved exactly what I'd suspected. You manipulated me. I gave you a choice. You made it. Serafina stood. And now you've made another one. You've tried to destroy my reputation because yours is crumbling. You've leaked private documents and spread half-truths because you can't accept that you lost something valuable. I lost it because you let me. No. Serafina's expression finally cracked slightly, showing a flash of genuine emotion. You lost it because you never actually had it. You never saw me, Kyle. You saw a reflection of yourself. Someone small enough to make you feel big. And the moment that stopped serving you, you walked away. She turned to leave, then stopped. The articles you've been planting will be gone by tomorrow. The journalists will retract them. The bloggers will delete their posts. Roman is very thorough when he wants to be. You can't erase the truth. The truth is you're a man who threw away something precious and can't handle the consequences. Serafina looked back at him one last time. Goodbye, Kyle. I genuinely hope you find whatever it is you're looking for, but you won't find it by destroying me. She walked out, leaving Kyle alone in the coffee shop with his cold coffee and crumbling certainties. He sat there for 20 minutes, staring at nothing, before his phone buzzed with a message from Marcus. Emergency meeting, my office, now, and Kyle, bring a lawyer. The end was coming faster than he'd anticipated. Kale stood on shaking legs and walked out into the afternoon sunlight, knowing with absolute certainty that he'd just crossed a line he couldn't uncross. He'd declared war on people who didn't fight fair, and now he was going to learn exactly what that cost. His phone buzzed one final time. Another message from an unknown number. No words, just an address. And beneath it, midnight, come alone, or we come to you. Kale deleted the message, but the address burned into his memory. This was it, the point of no return. He'd destroyed any chance of mercy. Now he just had to survive what came next. The address led to a warehouse district in Red Hook, where the streetlights barely functioned and the sound of water lapping against rotting pier pilings provided the only soundtrack to the darkness. Kyle arrived 15 minutes before midnight, parking his car 3 blocks away and walking the rest of the distance with his hands shoved deep in his jacket pockets, his breath forming clouds in the November cold. He'd spent the afternoon in Marcus's office listening to his business partner systematically dismantle what remained of their company. 3 investors had pulled out completely. 2 others were threatening legal action over misrepresentation and fraud. Baseless accusations that would go nowhere in court but would bleed them dry in legal fees before they got there. The hedge fund they'd spent 4 years building was circling the drain, and Marcus had made it abundantly clear that Kyle was the anchor dragging them down. You need to step away, Marcus had said, his voice tight with barely controlled fury. Publicly, announce you're taking a leave of absence for personal reasons. Let me salvage what's left. It's my company too. Was. Past tense. Marcus had slid dissolution papers across his desk. Sign these or I'll force you out through the board. Your choice. Kyle hadn't signed. Not yet. But the papers were in his car now, another reminder of how completely his life had detonated. The warehouse loomed ahead, its windows dark except for a faint glow coming from somewhere deep inside. The door was unlocked. Kale pushed it open and stepped into a space that smelled of motor oil and stagnant water, and something else, something metallic and organic that made his stomach tighten. Footsteps echoed from somewhere in the darkness. Mr. Mercer. Roman's voice came from everywhere and nowhere. Punctual, I appreciate that. Lights flickered on. Not the overhead fluorescents, but portable work lights positioned around the warehouse's center, creating an island of harsh illumination in an ocean of shadow. Roman stood in the middle of that island, still wearing a suit despite the hour, looking like he'd just stepped out of a board meeting rather than summoning someone to an abandoned building at midnight. 5 men stood positioned around the perimeter, armed, alert, professional. Kale's mouth went dry, but he forced himself to walk forward until he stood just outside the circle of light. You wanted to see me. I wanted to give you one final opportunity. Roman's expression remained neutral. To make this right. By right, you mean backing down, admitting I was wrong, letting you control the narrative. By right, I mean stopping before you destroy yourself completely. Roman gestured to one of his men, who stepped forward holding a tablet. Do you know what's going to happen tomorrow morning at 9 a.m.? Kyle said nothing. The Securities and Exchange Commission is going to open an investigation into your hedge fund. Anonymous tips about insider trading, market manipulation, fraudulent investment practices. Roman took the tablet and held it up, showing a document Kyle couldn't quite read from this distance. All completely fabricated, of course, but detailed enough to be taken seriously. Detailed enough to freeze your assets while they investigate. You can't I already have. Roman set the tablet down. Your bank accounts will be locked by noon. Your investment accounts by 2 p.m. Your credit cards will stop working by dinner time. And every piece of evidence that might exonerate you will mysteriously vanish or become corrupted during the investigation process. The warehouse suddenly felt smaller, the air thicker. Kyle struggled to keep his breathing steady. That's not all, Roman continued, his tone conversational, almost friendly. Your apartment lease? The owner has decided not to renew. Apparently there's been noise complaints, disruption to other tenants. You'll need to vacate by the end of the month. Your car lease? Also terminated. Your gym membership, your country club access, your professional organization memberships, all revoked for various administrative reasons. This is insane. This is power. Roman's voice hardened slightly. Real power. Not the kind you've been chasing, the performative networking and status climbing. I'm talking about the power to unmake someone's entire existence with a few phone calls, to turn them into a ghost while they're still breathing. Kale felt his legs weakening but refused to show it. So what? You're going to erase me? Make me disappear? No, I'm going to give you a choice. Roman nodded to another one of his men, who stepped forward with a briefcase. In here is $5 million. Cash. Untraceable. Also a new identity, passport, driver's license, social security number, complete background documentation. You take this, get on a plane tonight, and start over somewhere far from here. Australia, Southeast Asia, South America, somewhere where the name Kyle Mercer means nothing. The briefcase sat on the concrete floor between them like a landmine. Or, Kyle's voice came out rougher than intended, or you refuse. And tomorrow morning when the SEC raids your office, they'll also find evidence of other crimes. More serious crimes. The kind that come with federal prison sentences. Roman's expression remained perfectly calm. I'm giving you an escape. The only one you're going to get. Take it, or spend the next decade fighting charges that will bankrupt and break you even if you somehow manage to beat them. Kale stared at the briefcase. $5 million. A new life. Freedom from the wreckage he'd created. All he had to do was admit defeat. Admit that Serafina had won. That Roman had won. That he'd been completely and utterly destroyed by people who operated on a level he couldn't even comprehend. I need proof, Kale heard himself say, that what you're saying is real, that this isn't just a bluff. Roman smiled slightly, not with pleasure, but with something like respect for the audacity. He pulled out his phone, tapped the screen a few times, then held it up. Kyle's own face stared back at him from what looked like an official SEC document. Subject: Kale Mercer. Investigation into securities fraud, insider trading, and investment scheme violations. Priority: high. Status: active investigation commencing 9 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. The date stamp read, tomorrow. Roman lowered the phone. This is happening. The only question is whether you're here when it does. Kale's mind raced through possibilities, options, escape routes. He could call a lawyer, could try to get ahead of the investigation, could... Who was he kidding? Roman had already thought of everything, had already closed every door. This wasn't a negotiation. This was an execution with a single escape hatch. Why? The word came out before Kyle could stop it. Why go to all this trouble? Why not just kill me and be done with it? Because Serafina asked me not to. Roman's expression softened almost imperceptibly. She doesn't want you dead, Mr. Mercer. She wants you gone. There's a difference. She told you to destroy my life instead. No, she told me to give you a chance to choose a different one. Roman gestured to the briefcase. This is that chance. The only one you'll receive. Kale looked at the briefcase, looked at Roman, looked at the armed men positioned around them like pieces on a chessboard he'd never had a chance of winning. Everything he'd worked for, the reputation, the connections, the carefully constructed identity, it was all ash now. Roman was just offering to sweep away the remains. His phone buzzed in his pocket. Kale pulled it out, saw Vivian's name, and answered. "Don't take the deal." Her voice was urgent, breathless. "I'm looking at something right now, something that changes everything." "Vivian, this isn't a good time. Listen to me. I got access to more documents. Internal Blackthorn communications. Kyle, Serafina didn't just hide her identity from you. She was working with Victor to keep you away from the family months before you even applied for that investment partnership." Kyle felt ice sliding through his veins. "What?" "Victor rejected your partnership proposal because Serafina told him to. She fed him information about your business practices, your investors, everything. She poisoned that well deliberately. She wanted you humiliated at the gala. This whole thing was orchestrated." Roman's expression hadn't changed, but something in his eyes sharpened. "You're sure?" Kyle asked. "I'm looking at the emails right now. She manipulated you from the beginning, not just by hiding who she was, by actively sabotaging your ambitions while pretending to be your supportive wife." Vivian's voice carried vindictive satisfaction. "You were right to fight back. She deserves everything that's coming." Kyle lowered the phone slowly, his mind reeling. If what Vivian was saying was true, if Serafina had actively worked against him, had deliberately engineered his failure at the gala, then this wasn't just about hiding her identity. This was about revenge, about punishing him for wanting more than she could offer. "That call was illuminating," Roman said quietly. "May I ask who that was?" "Someone who actually tells me the truth." Kael's voice came out harder now. "Unlike your wife." "And what truth is that?" "That Serafina didn't just hide who she was. She sabotaged me, deliberately. She told Victor to reject my partnership proposal. She wanted me humiliated." For the first time, Roman's carefully controlled expression cracked slightly, not with surprise, with something closer to disappointment. "Mr. Mercer, who do you think gave Vivian those documents?" The warehouse tilted sideways. Kale felt his knees actually buckle slightly before he caught himself. "What?" "Vivian Laurent has been working for me for the past 3 days. Every document she's shown you, every piece of information. I gave it to her to give to you." Roman's voice remained calm, almost gentle. "Because I needed to know what kind of man you really were, whether you would take responsibility for your failures or look for someone else to blame." "You're lying." "Am I?" Roman pulled out his phone again, tapped something, and held it up. A text message exchange. Vivian's number. Messages from this morning. He took the bait. Believes S sabotaged the gala. And Roman's response, "Good. Let's see what he does with that information." Kale couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The concrete floor felt unstable beneath his feet. "The emails Vivian showed you, forgeries, very good ones, I'll admit. We have talented people." Roman pocketed his phone. "Serafina never told Victor to reject your proposal. Victor rejected it because your business model was aggressive to the point of recklessness, and your reputation for burning partners was already spreading through the industry." No, that's the truth." Roman's voice cut through Kael's protests like a blade. "You failed on your own merits. Serafina hiding her identity didn't cause that failure. It just revealed what was already there. A man more interested in climbing than in building anything real." Kael's vision was blurring at the edges. Every certainty he'd been clinging to, every justification for his actions, was disintegrating. "I gave you multiple opportunities to walk away," Roman continued. "Multiple chances to accept responsibility and rebuild your life elsewhere. Instead, you chose escalation, chose to spread lies about Serafina through the media, chose to try to destroy her reputation because your own was crumbling. She manipulated me. She protected herself from you." Roman's voice rose slightly for the first time, showing a flash of genuine anger. "Because she saw who you were becoming before you did, and everything that's happened since, every door that's closed, every bridge that's burned, you did that to yourself." The warehouse was spinning now. Kael reached out, found a concrete pillar, leaned against it to stay upright. Vivian had played him. Roman had played him. And he'd been so desperate to believe he was the victim that he'd never questioned the narrative they'd fed him. "The SEC investigation is real," Roman said, his voice returning to that terrible calm. "But it's based on your actual business practices. The aggressive short positions you took on companies you knew were overvalued. The insider information you traded on 18 months ago. The clients you misled about risk exposure. You can't prove any of that. I don't have to prove it. The SEC will. They're very thorough when they have reason to look closely. Roman gestured to the briefcase again. So here we are. Back to the original choice. Take the money and disappear. Or stay and face what you've actually done. Cale slid down the pillar until he was sitting on the cold concrete, his head in his hands. Everything had fallen apart so quickly, so completely. And only now, only here in this warehouse with Roman Volkov standing over him like a judge delivering sentence, did Kyle begin to understand the magnitude of his self-deception. He'd never been the protagonist of this story. He'd been the cautionary tale. I loved her. The words came out broken, barely audible. I actually loved her. I know. Roman's voice softened again. That's the tragedy. You loved her, but you loved the idea of success more. And when you had to choose between them, you chose your ambitions. That's not villainy, that's just weakness. Kyle looked up, his eyes burning. So what now? I take your money and run? Spend the rest of my life hiding under a different name? Yes? And if I refuse? If I decide to face the investigation, fight the charges, tell everyone what you've done, then you'll lose. Roman's certainty was absolute. You'll spend years in legal battles that will drain whatever resources you have left. You'll probably end up in prison. And when you get out, you'll be exactly where you are now, alone, discredited, and broken. Except you'll be older, more bitter, more broken. The truth of it settled over Kyle like a burial shroud. He'd lost. Not because he'd been outmaneuvered, though he had been. Not because Serafina and Roman were more powerful, though they were. He'd lost because he'd never understood what the game actually was. While he'd been playing checkers, moving piece by piece towards some imagined victory, they'd been playing chess at a level he couldn't even perceive. I need time. Kyle's voice was hoarse. To think. You have until dawn. 6 hours. Roman nodded to his men, who began moving toward the exits. The briefcase stays here. You come back before sunrise and take it, or you don't come back at all. Either way, this conversation is over. Roman walked toward the door, then paused. For what it's worth, Mr. Mercer, I think you could have been something better than this. If you'd chosen differently at any of the dozen decision points where you had the chance. But you didn't. And now you're here. Then he was gone, his footsteps echoing away into silence, leaving Kyle alone in the warehouse with nothing but the briefcase and the wreckage of his understanding of himself. Kyle sat on the cold concrete for an hour before he could move. His phone was dead. No surprise, he'd forgotten to charge it. The work lights had been left on, casting harsh shadows that made the warehouse feel like a cathedral built to celebrate failure. He thought about Serafina, really thought about her for the first time in months. Not the version of her he'd constructed in his mind, the manipulative heiress playing him from the beginning, but the actual woman who'd sat across from him at that cafe in Tribeca. You never saw me, she'd said. You saw a reflection of yourself. Had she been right? Kyle forced himself to remember their marriage honestly, the way she'd light up when he came home early from work, the way she'd laugh at his terrible jokes, the way she'd believed in him even when his plans seemed impossible. He'd called that weakness, called her unambitious, when really, she just wanted something he didn't know how to give. Presence, attention, love that wasn't conditional on what she could do for his career. And when she'd discovered she was a blackthorn, when she'd suddenly had access to all the wealth and power Kyle had been chasing, she'd kept it hidden. Not to manipulate him, but to test whether he could love her without knowing what she was worth. He'd failed that test spectacularly, proven exactly what she'd suspected, that he valued opportunity over connection. That his ambition was a hunger that would devour anything in its path, including her. Kale pulled himself to his feet, every muscle aching like he'd been in a physical fight. He walked over to the briefcase and stared down at it. $5 million. A new identity, a chance to start over somewhere far from the wreckage of Kyle Mercer. It was more mercy than he deserved, more mercy than he'd shown Serafina when he'd leaked those documents and tried to destroy her reputation to salvage his own. His hand reached for the briefcase handle, then stopped. If he took this, if he ran, He'd be admitting that everything Roman had said was true, that he was a coward who'd rather hide than face the consequences of his choices. But if he stayed? Kyle thought about prison, about years spent in a cell, his youth dissolving into regret and rage, about coming out on the other side middle-aged and unemployable, with nothing but bitterness to show for his ambitions. Neither choice was good, but one was at least honest. Kyle picked up the briefcase. It was heavy, real, the weight of salvation or damnation depending on perspective. He walked toward the warehouse exit, the case swinging at his side, his footsteps echoing in the empty space. Outside, dawn was still 3 hours away. The streets were empty except for occasional taxis and night shift workers heading home. Kyle walked back to his car in a daze, set the briefcase in the passenger seat, and sat behind the wheel without starting the engine. His phone, finally charged from the car's USB port, began buzzing with messages. He ignored them all except one, from Serafina. Roman told me about tonight, about the choice he gave you. Whatever you decide, I hope you find peace. You deserve that much, even if you didn't give it to me. S. Kyle read the message 3 times, trying to find hidden meaning or cruelty in the words, and finding nothing but exhausted honesty. She'd moved on, not to punish him, but because staying tethered to his chaos would have destroyed her. And now she was offering him the same gift, the chance to move on, even if it meant running. Kale opened the briefcase. Cash. Neat stacks of $100 bills. A passport with his photo, but a different name, David Chen, birth certificates, credit cards. A complete identity waiting to be inhabited. $5 million could buy a lot of forgetting. Could buy a house on some beach somewhere. Could buy years of living quietly, while the noise of his New York life faded into memory. Could buy everything except the ability to look at himself in the mirror without seeing a coward. Kale closed the briefcase and started the car. He drove through Manhattan as the city began waking up. Delivery trucks making their rounds, coffee shops opening their doors, early commuters trudging toward subway stations. He drove past his apartment building, past his office, past all the landmarks of the life he'd built and destroyed. He drove until he found himself outside a 24-hour pharmacy in Queens, bought a burner phone, and made a call he'd been avoiding. "This is Agent Rebecca Hollis, SEC Enforcement Division. How can I help you?" "My name is Cale Mercer." His voice was steady now, finally certain. "I think you're about to open an investigation into my business practices. I'd like to come in voluntarily and tell you everything." There was a pause on the other end. "Mr. Mercer, I'm not sure what you're referring to. You will be, by 9 o'clock this morning, but I'm coming in now before anyone else tells you what happened. I want to tell you myself." Another pause, longer this time. "Come to our office. I'll meet you there in an hour." Cale hung up and sat in the pharmacy parking lot watching the sky lighten from black to gray to pale gold. He'd made his choice. Not the smart choice, not the safe choice, but maybe the only choice that would let him sleep at night. He left the briefcase in the car, walked to the subway station, and rode downtown toward the SEC offices in Lower Manhattan as the morning rush began building around him. He didn't know what would happen next, didn't know if cooperating would make things better or worse, didn't know if Roman would respect the decision or simply accelerate his destruction. But for the first time in years, Kyle felt something other than the constant gnawing hunger that had driven every decision. He felt empty, hollowed out, but clean. The SEC offices were intimidating, all glass and steel and bureaucratic efficiency. Agent Hollis met him in the lobby, her expression skeptical but curious. "Mr. Mercer?" "Yes." "You said you wanted to talk before our investigation officially begins. That's an unusual approach." "I'm tired of running." Kyle met her eyes directly. "From consequences. From responsibility. From the truth about who I've become. So I'm here to tell you everything. Every corner I cut, every rule I bent, every line I crossed thinking the ends justified the means." Agent Hollis studied him for a long moment, then nodded toward the elevators. "Let's talk." They rode up in silence, and Cale watched his reflection in the polished elevator doors. A man who'd climbed so high he'd forgotten what it felt like to stand on solid ground. Now he was about to find out if there was any ground left beneath him at all, or if he'd burned it all away chasing shadows and calling them dreams. The elevator doors opened onto a floor of cubicles and conference rooms, and the machinery of justice grinding forward. Cale stepped out and followed Agent Hollis toward an interview room, knowing that whatever happened next, the man who'd stepped into that warehouse 12 hours ago was gone. And whoever walked out of this building would have to learn how to be someone completely different, someone honest, even if honesty came too late to save him. The interview room was smaller than Kyle had expected. Concrete walls painted institutional beige, a metal table bolted to the floor, two chairs that looked like they'd been designed specifically to be uncomfortable. Agent Hollis sat across from him with a digital recorder between them, her expression neutral but her eyes sharp enough to cut through steel. "Before we begin," she said, "I need to make sure you understand your rights. You have the right to an attorney. Anything you say can and will be used against you. You're here voluntarily, which means you can leave at any time. Do you understand?" "Yes." "And you still want to proceed without counsel present?" "Yes." Cale's voice was steady. "I want to tell you everything before anyone else shapes the narrative." Agent Hollis pressed record. "State your name for the record." "Cale Vincent Mercer." "And you're here to discuss your business practices at Mercer Capital Management?" "I'm here to confess." The word felt strange in his mouth, foreign, but also necessary. "To securities violations, to misleading investors, to trading on insider information, to everything I did trying to build an empire that was never actually mine." For the next 4 hours, Kyle talked. He detailed every corner he'd cut, every regulation he'd skirted, every time he'd prioritized growth over ethics. He described the Thompson deal where he'd received advance notice of FDA approval for a pharmaceutical company and had positioned his fund accordingly. He explained how he'd misrepresented risk exposure to 3 separate institutional investors, promising conservative growth while making aggressive short bets that could have bankrupted them all. He outlined the network of information sharing between himself and other fund managers. Nothing egregious enough to trigger immediate red flags, but sustained and systematic enough to constitute a pattern of misconduct. Agent Hollis asked precise questions, taking notes, occasionally stopping him to clarify dates or amounts. She didn't seem surprised by anything he said. If Roman had already seeded the investigation, she'd probably seen preliminary reports. But Kyle's voluntary cooperation seemed to shift something in her demeanor, from predator stalking prey to professional documenting facts. By the time they finished, Kyle felt gutted, empty, like he'd performed surgery on himself without anesthesia and survived only because the alternative was dying slowly from infection. "That's quite an admission," Agent Hollis said finally, turning off the recorder. "You understand this likely means criminal charges, prison time." "I know." "And you're still willing to cooperate fully, provide documentation, testify if needed?" "Yes." She studied him for a long moment. "Why?" "Most people in your position lawyer up and fight every inch of the way." Cale laughed, a hollow, exhausted sound. "Because I'm tired of being the person who did these things. And the only way to stop being that person is to face what I've done." Agent Hollis nodded slowly. "We'll be in touch. Don't leave the city. And Mr. Mercer, get a lawyer. Even if you're cooperating, you'll need representation." Kyle stood on legs that felt like they belonged to someone else and walked out of the SEC building into morning sunshine that seemed too bright, too cheerful for the magnitude of what he'd just done. His phone buzzed. 12 missed calls from Marcus. 8 from unknown numbers. 3 voicemails he didn't bother listening to. And 1 text from Roman. "I heard, unexpected, we should talk." Kyle ignored it and started walking. He didn't know where he was going, just knew he needed to move, to feel his body working, his lungs pulling in air, proof that he was still alive despite everything. He walked for 3 hours, through financial district crowds and across the Brooklyn Bridge, past tourists taking selfies and street vendors selling pretzels, and artists sketching portraits for $20. The city moved around him with indifferent efficiency, millions of people pursuing their own ambitions and heartbreaks and victories, none of them aware that Kyle Mercer's entire existence had just collapsed and reformed into something unrecognizable. By early afternoon, he found himself outside a small bookstore in Brooklyn. Not the one where Serafina had worked, that would have been too pathetic, but similar enough to trigger a cascade of memories. The smell of old paper and coffee, the quiet rustling of pages, The sense of time moving differently inside these walls than it did in the brutal efficiency of Manhattan finance. Kale pushed open the door. Inside, an elderly woman looked up from the register. "Can I help you find something?" "No, thank you. I'm just browsing." He wandered through the narrow aisles, past fiction and philosophy and poetry, until he found himself in front of a section Serafina used to love. Classic literature, worn paperbacks with broken spines and margins filled with previous readers' notes. He pulled out a copy of Anna Karenina randomly and opened it to a page that someone had underlined. He stepped down, trying not to look long at her, as if she were the sun. Yet he saw her, like the sun, even without looking. Kyle closed the book and put it back on the shelf. He'd never looked at Serafina like that, had never been willing to be blinded by anyone except his own ambitions. His phone rang. Marcus again. This time Kyle answered. "Where the hell are you? Marcus's voice was barely controlled fury. "I've been trying to reach you all morning." "I was busy." "Busy? The SEC just left my office. They're seizing files, freezing accounts. What did you do?" "I told them the truth." Silence. Then, "You what?" "I confessed. Everything we did. Everything I did. They're building a case and I'm cooperating fully." "Are you out of your fucking mind?" Marcus's voice escalated towards something close to a scream. "Do you have any idea what this means? For me? For everyone we work with?" "I know exactly what it means." "No, clearly you don't. Because if you did, you wouldn't have walked into a federal building and committed professional suicide without even consulting me first." Marcus was breathing hard now, audibly trying to control his rage. "I have a family, Kyle. A mortgage. A life that doesn't include federal indictment because you decided to develop a conscience at the worst possible moment. I'm sorry." "Sorry? Sorry doesn't pay legal fees. Sorry doesn't rebuild a reputation. Sorry doesn't—" Marcus cut himself off. When he spoke again, his voice was cold. "We're done. Don't contact me again. Don't use my name. If they ask about me during your cooperation, you tell them I had no knowledge of anything illegal. Are we clear?" "Marcus, are we clear?" "Yes." The line went dead. Kale stood in the bookstore aisle holding a phone that suddenly felt like a lead weight and understood with absolute clarity that he'd just burned the last bridge connecting him to his old life. No business, no partner, no reputation, no future in the industry he'd spent his adult life trying to conquer. Nothing but the hollow satisfaction of having finally told the truth. His phone buzzed again. Another text from Roman. "The offer still stands. 5 million. New identity. Gone by tonight. Last chance." Kyle stared at the message, his thumb hovering over the keyboard. Part of him wanted to take it, wanted to run before the full weight of consequences crashed down, before the media got hold of the story, before his face was plastered across financial news sites with headlines about fraud and deception and the spectacular collapse of a wannabe titan. But he'd made his choice in that warehouse, and he was done running. Kale typed back, "No, I'm staying. Whatever happens next, I'm staying." He hit send and turned off his phone completely. The bookstore owner looked up as he headed for the door. "Find what you were looking for?" "No," Kyle said, "but I think that's the point." Outside, the afternoon had turned gray with threatening rain. Kyle walked back toward Manhattan, past brownstones and bodegas, and playgrounds where kids screamed with the kind of joy he couldn't remember ever feeling. By the time he reached his apartment building, the first news alerts were hitting. Breaking. SEC opens investigation into Mercer Capital Management. Hedge fund manager under federal scrutiny for investment fraud. Kale Mercer faces criminal charges following voluntary confession. His phone, turned back on only to check messages, exploded with texts and calls, journalists requesting interviews, former colleagues expressing shock or distancing themselves or offering surprisingly genuine support. His landlord informing him that given the circumstances, perhaps it would be best if he vacated immediately. And one message from a number he didn't recognize, Penthouse, Blackthorn Tower, 8 p.m. tonight. Come alone. This is the last conversation. Serafina wanted to see him. Kyle sat on his couch, the expensive leather couch he'd bought to look successful, and stared at the message until the letters blurred. This was it. The final confrontation. Not in a warehouse surrounded by armed men, not in a coffee shop with manufactured privacy, but in her territory, in the center of the empire she'd inherited and he'd been denied. He could refuse, could ignore the message and spend the evening packing his belongings and preparing for whatever came next. But he needed to see her one more time, needed to say things he should have said months ago, years ago, before everything turned toxic and irreparable. Kale showered and changed into clean clothes, jeans and a sweater, nothing performative, and took the subway to Midtown as evening settled over the city. Blackthorn Tower rose 73 stories above street level, all glass and steel and architectural intimidation, the kind of building that announced its importance with every vertical foot. Security in the lobby checked his name against a list, made a phone call, then directed him to a private elevator that required a key card to access the upper floors. The ride-up was silent and surreal. Kyle watched the floor numbers climb, 50, 60, 70, and felt like he was ascending toward judgment. The elevator opened directly into a penthouse that occupied the entire 73rd floor. Floor-to-ceiling windows on all sides offered panoramic views of Manhattan spreading out in every direction like a circuit board of light and ambition. The furnishings were minimalist but clearly expensive, the kind of wealth that didn't need to announce itself because it was simply assumed. Serafina stood by the western windows, silhouetted against the sunset, wearing simple black pants and a white blouse. No jewelry, no armor, just herself. She turned as he stepped out of the elevator. "You came. You asked." They stood 20 feet apart, the space between them feeling like a chasm filled with everything they'd done to each other. "Roman's not here," Serafina said quietly. "I asked him to give us privacy. This conversation is just between us." "Okay. I heard what you did this morning, going to the SEC voluntarily." She moved away from the windows, closer but still maintaining distance. "That surprised me. Surprised me too." "Why did you do it?" Kale exhaled slowly. "Because I was tired of being afraid, of what people would think, of losing what I'd built, of facing the truth about who I'd become." He met her eyes directly. "And because you were right, about everything, about me." Serafina's expression softened slightly but didn't break. "I didn't ask you here for an apology." "Then why?" "Because despite everything, despite how much you hurt me, how much you tried to hurt me after, I need you to understand something." She moved to a seating area, gestured for him to join her. "Sit, please." Kale sat on a white couch that probably cost more than his first car. Serafina took a chair across from him, her posture straight but her hands folded tightly in her lap. "When Victor's investigators found me," she began, "I didn't believe them at first. Thought it was a scam, some elaborate scheme to steal whatever little I had. But they showed me documents, photos, my mother's birth certificate, evidence I couldn't deny." She paused, staring out at the city. "And my first instinct, my very first thought, was to tell you. To share this impossible thing that had just happened. Because despite everything that was already breaking between us, you were still my husband, still the person I'd chosen to build a life with." Kyle felt something tightening in his chest. "But then I remembered conversations we'd had, things you'd said, the way you talked about wealthy people, powerful people, like they were a different species, something to be hunted or befriended or used, never just people." Serafina's voice remained steady, but Kyle could hear the pain beneath it. "And I realized that if I told you, if you knew what I was connected to, everything would change. You'd see me differently, not as Sarah, your wife, but as Serafina Blackthorn, opportunity incarnate. I wouldn't have—" "Yes, you would have." Her interruption was gentle but firm. "Because that's who you were becoming. Someone who measured worth by utility, who saw relationships as transactions, and I couldn't bear the thought of becoming just another asset in your portfolio." Kyle closed his eyes, feeling the truth of it like a blade between his ribs. "So I stayed quiet," Serafina continued, "and I watched, to see if the man I'd married was still in there somewhere. If you could choose me, choose us, without knowing what came attached. And I didn't." "No, you didn't." She looked at him directly now. "You asked for a divorce because I was holding you back, because I didn't have the right connections or ambitions, because I was content with a small life, and you needed someone who wanted the same big things you did. I was an idiot. You were ambitious beyond your capacity for self-awareness. Serafina's tone wasn't cruel, just factual. And I could have fought harder. Could have told you the truth then and maybe saved the marriage. But I realized I didn't want to be married to someone I had to bribe with my family name to make them stay. The penthouse felt too big suddenly. Too empty despite the furniture and art and expensive everything. After you left, Serafina said quietly, I spent weeks thinking I'd failed somehow. That if I'd been better, more interesting, more anything, you would have chosen differently. But Roman helped me understand something important. What's that? That your leaving wasn't about my inadequacy. It was about yours. Your inability to see value in anything that didn't advance your climb. She leaned forward slightly. And everything that's happened since, every door that's closed, every bridge that's burned, that's not revenge, Kale. That's consequence. I know. Do you? Her eyes searched his face. Because you spent weeks trying to convince yourself I was the villain, that I'd manipulated you, that everything was some elaborate scheme to destroy you, when the truth is much simpler and much sadder. What's the truth? That we were two people who wanted different things and were too stubborn or too scared to admit it until the damage was irreversible. Serafina stood, walked back to the windows. I didn't engineer your humiliation at the gala. I didn't tell Victor to reject your proposal. I didn't orchestrate your fall. You did all of that yourself by building a foundation made of compromises and corner-cutting and relationships you never actually valued. Kale stood as well, his legs unsteady. So why am I here? If not for apology or explanation, why bring me to the top of your tower to tell me what I already know? Serafina turned from the window, and for the first time since he'd arrived, Kyle saw real emotion breaking through her careful control. Because I needed to see if there was anything left worth saving. The words hit him like a physical blow. Not us, she clarified quickly. That's over. That ended the day you asked for the divorce. But you, the person you were before ambition, poisoned everything. The man who read poetry to me in bed and laughed at stupid jokes and believed he could build something meaningful. Her voice cracked slightly. I needed to know if that person still existed somewhere under all the damage you've done to yourself. And? Kale could barely get the word out. I don't know yet. Serafina wiped her eyes quickly, angry at herself for showing vulnerability. But walking into the SEC this morning and confessing everything? That's the first thing you've done in years that looks like courage instead of calculation. Kale felt tears burning behind his eyes and didn't try to stop them. I destroyed everything, my career, my reputation, any future I might have had in this city. Yes, and I did it to myself. Yes. So what now? He spread his hands helplessly. I face criminal charges, probably go to prison, come out on the other side unemployable and alone. Is that supposed to be redemption? No. Serafina's voice was quiet but certain. That's just accountability. Redemption is what you build after you've paid for your mistakes. If you're capable of building anything at all. Before Kyle could respond, the elevator chimed. The doors opened and Roman stepped out, his expression unreadable. He looked at Serafina first, some silent communication passing between them, then turned to Kyle. I wasn't eavesdropping, Roman said, but I do need to speak with you, both of you. Serafina nodded. What is it? Roman pulled out his phone, tapped something, then held it up, showing a news alert. Vivienne Laurent was found dead an hour ago. Apparent suicide. Pills and alcohol in her apartment. No note. The penthouse tilted sideways. Kale felt his knees buckle and caught himself against the back of the couch. What? Police are calling it suicide, Roman continued, his voice carefully neutral. But given her recent activities, the documents she was distributing, the people she was working with, there will be questions, investigations. You killed her! Kale's voice came out strangled. Because she helped me, I didn't touch her. Roman's tone remained calm. But there are other people who didn't appreciate her selling information to multiple parties. People within the Blackthorn organization who saw her as a liability. People who handle problems quietly. Jesus Christ, Kyle stumbled backward. She's dead because of me, because I believed her, because She's dead because she played a dangerous game with dangerous people. Roman pocketed his phone. You didn't force her to steal documents or fabricate evidence or work for competing interests. She made those choices herself, just like you made yours. Serafina had gone pale. Roman, tell me you didn't. I didn't. Roman looked at his wife with complete honesty. I wanted her gone, out of the city, away from this situation. But I wouldn't have killed her. That's not who we are. But someone did. Yes, someone did. And now the police will investigate, which means they'll look into everything she was involved with, including the forged documents she gave to Kyle, including the media contacts she was feeding stories to, including every person she interacted with in the last 2 weeks. Roman turned back to Kale. Which means they'll look at you very closely, and they'll want to know why a woman helping you destroy Serafina's reputation suddenly ended up dead. The room spun. Kyle grabbed the couch again, his vision blurring at the edges. I would never. I know, Roman's voice was oddly gentle. But appearances matter. Timing matters. And right now you look like a man with motive and opportunity. A man who was working with the victim just days before she died. A man already facing federal charges who might have wanted to silence the one person who could connect him to a conspiracy. This is insane. Kyle's voice was rising toward panic. I was at the SEC all morning. I have an alibi. Vivian died sometime between midnight and 3 a.m., according to preliminary reports. Roman watched Kyle's face. Where were you during those hours? I was at home, alone, after the warehouse meeting. Kyle felt ice sliding through his veins. No one saw me. I didn't talk to anyone. I just sat there trying to figure out what to do. So you have no alibi? No. The three of them stood in the penthouse silence, the city glittering below them, indifferent to this latest catastrophe. They're going to arrest me, Kale heard himself say it like he was standing outside his own body, for something I didn't do, on top of everything I actually did. Probably, Roman agreed, unless we help you. Kale's head snapped up. What? Serafina moved beside Roman, their unified front unmistakable. We can provide evidence that you were under surveillance last night, that you were never near Vivian's apartment, that you couldn't have been involved. Why would you do that? Because despite everything, Serafina said quietly, I don't want you to go down for something you didn't do. You've made enough mistakes to answer for without adding a murder charge to the list. Kale stared at them both, these people he'd tried to destroy, who now held his life in their hands like a fragile thing that might shatter if mishandled. What do you want in return? Nothing. Roman's certainty was absolute. This isn't a transaction. This is what decent people do, even for someone who wasn't decent to them. The tears Kyle had been holding back finally broke free, hot and shameful, running down his face while he stood in the penthouse tower of the woman he'd loved and abandoned, accepting mercy from the man who could have killed him without consequence. I'm sorry, what? The words came out broken. For everything. For all of it. I know it doesn't fix anything, but I need you to know. I'm so goddamn sorry. Serafina crossed the distance between them and did something Kyle never expected. She hugged him, not romantically, not with anything resembling forgiveness, but with the kind of compassion you'd show someone standing on the edge of a cliff deciding whether to jump. I know, she whispered. I know you are. Then she stepped back, wiping her own eyes, and the moment was over. Roman will provide the evidence to the police, she said, her voice steadier now. But Kyle, this is the last time we help you. After this, you're on your own. Whatever happens with the SEC, with the media, with your future, that's yours to navigate. I understand. Do you? She held his gaze. Because the next few months are going to be hell. Prison is a real possibility. Your name will be dragged through every outlet in the country. People will mock you, hate you, forget you. And through all of that, you'll have to find a way to become someone better than who you were. Someone worthy of the second chance you're being given. I don't know if I can. Neither do I. Serafina's honesty was brutal but clean. But I hope you try. Because the man I married, the one who existed before all this, he deserved better than what you turned him into. Roman gestured toward the elevator. You should go. The police will probably want to question you tomorrow. Get a lawyer. Tell them the truth about your relationship with Vivian, and for the love of everything holy, stop trying to control the narrative. Just be honest and let the chips fall where they may. Kale nodded numbly and walked toward the elevator. As the doors began to close, Serafina called out, "Kyle?" He looked up. "I really did love you, once. Before everything went wrong." Her smile was sad and final. "I hope wherever you end up, whatever life you build from the ashes of this one, I hope you remember that someone loved you when you were nobody. And maybe that's worth more than all the empires you tried to climb." The elevator doors closed. Kyle rode down 73 floors with tears streaming down his face, and Serafina's words echoing in the small space until they were all he could hear. Someone loved you when you were nobody. When was the last time he'd felt like anything other than a nobody desperately pretending to be somebody? When had ambition stopped being a goal and started being a prison? The lobby doors opened and Kyle stepped out into the Manhattan night, the November cold hitting him like a slap, pedestrians streaming past him in both directions pursuing their own desperations and dreams. His phone buzzed. A news alert. Former associate of Kyle Mercer found dead in apparent suicide. And beneath it, sources say Vivian Laurent was cooperating with multiple investigations before her death. The storm was coming, faster than he'd anticipated, more brutal than he could have prepared for. And Kyle was standing directly in its path with nothing but the clothes on his back and the fragile hope that somewhere beneath all the damage, something worth saving still existed. He started walking, not toward his apartment or any destination, just forward through the city lights and street noise and the chaotic beauty of millions of lives intersecting without ever truly touching. And for the first time in years, Kyle wasn't thinking about where he was going. He was thinking about who he wanted to be when he got there. If he got there, if there was anything left of him worth arriving at all. The rain started falling again, cold and clean, washing over him as he disappeared into the anonymous crowds of New York City. Just another person trying to survive another night in a world that didn't care whether he succeeded or failed, and that somehow felt like the beginning of something. Not redemption. Not yet. But maybe the first honest step toward becoming someone who could earn it. The police came for Kyle at 6 a.m, 3 days after Vivian's death. He'd been expecting them, had barely slept, sitting in his apartment watching the door like it might explode inward at any moment. When the knock finally came, polite, professional, inevitable, it was almost a relief. Detective Sarah Chen and her partner, Detective Marcus Rodriguez, stood in the hallway with badges and expressions that suggested they'd seen every variation of human failure and weren't impressed by any of them. Kale Mercer? Yes. We need you to come downtown. Answer some questions about Vivian Laurent. Am I under arrest? Not yet. Detective Chen's tone was neutral, but we can make it formal if you'd prefer. Kyle grabbed his jacket. I'll come voluntarily. I have nothing to hide. The ride to the precinct was silent. Kyle sat in the back of an unmarked sedan watching the city wake up. Coffee carts opening, commuters flooding subway stations, delivery trucks double-parked on every block. Normal life continuing with complete indifference to the fact that his was systematically disintegrating. The interrogation room was different from the SEC interview space. Smaller, grimier, the kind of place designed to make you feel guilty even if you weren't. Detective Chen set a folder on the table between them. Tell us about your relationship with Vivian Laurent. We dated briefly, a few months ago, ended when I became publicly toxic after the Blackthorn Gala. But you stayed in contact. She contacted me, about a week ago, said she had information about Serafina Blackthorn, about when Serafina really discovered her identity. And you believed her? Kale met Chen's eyes directly. I wanted to believe her, because it fit the narrative I'd constructed where I was the victim instead of the failure. Detective Rodriguez leaned forward. You met with her. Multiple times, exchanged documents, coordinated media leaks designed to damage Serafina Blackthorn's reputation. Yes, that's quite a motive. If Vivian decided to recant, to admit the documents were forged, to expose you as the architect of a smear campaign, Chen opened the folder, revealing photographs from Vivian's apartment. She could have destroyed what little credibility you had left. Kyle looked at the photos. Vivian's body on a bed surrounded by empty pill bottles and a half-finished bottle of vodka. Her face peaceful in a way it never had been in life. Death as mercy or punishment depending on interpretation. I didn't kill her. Where were you between midnight and 3 a.m. the night she died? At home, alone, after a meeting with Roman Volkov. Both detectives' expressions sharpened. Roman Volkov, the alleged crime boss. Yes. What was that meeting about? Kale hesitated, then decided the truth was simpler than any lie he could construct. He gave me a choice. Take $5 million and disappear, or stay and face the consequences of everything I'd done. I chose to stay. Can anyone corroborate that? His men, but I doubt they'll talk to you. Detective Chen closed the folder. Here's what we know. Vivian Laurent was selling information to multiple parties. The Blackthorn family, competitors within their organization. You, possibly others we haven't identified yet. She was playing a dangerous game and it got her killed. You think it was murder? We think suicide is a convenient narrative. Pills and alcohol leave no defensive wounds, no signs of struggle. Easy to stage if you know what you're doing. Rodriguez leaned back. But we can't prove it wasn't suicide, and without proof, we can't charge anyone. So why am I here? Because you're the only person involved who might actually tell us the truth. Chen's voice softened slightly. Everyone else, Roman Volkov, the Blackthorn organization, the people Vivian was selling to, they're professionals. They know how to lie, how to make evidence disappear, how to look us in the eye and dare us to prove anything. But you think I'm amateur enough to be honest. We think you're desperate enough. Rodriguez slid a photograph across the table. This was taken 2 nights ago. Outside Vivian's apartment building. Recognize yourself? Kale stared at the image. Grainy security footage showing him standing on the street looking up at the building. He remembered that moment. Walking aimlessly after leaving Roman's warehouse. Ending up outside Vivian's place without consciously deciding to go there. I was there for maybe 5 minutes. I didn't go inside. I just stood there. Why? Because I was trying to decide if I should warn her that the people she was playing against were more dangerous than she realized. Kale's voice cracked. But I was too much of a coward, too worried about protecting myself. So I left. And she died that night. Yes. The detectives exchanged a look that Kyle couldn't interpret. Here's the problem, Chen said finally. We pulled Vivian's phone records, text messages. She sent you something at 1:47 a.m., the night she died. You want to tell us what it said? Kyle felt his stomach drop. I don't know what you're talking about. Rodriguez pulled out an evidence bag containing a phone, Vivian's phone. He scrolled to a message thread and held it up. Help me. They're here. Please, Kyle. Time stopped. Kale stared at the message, his mind refusing to process what he was seeing. I never received that. I swear to you, I never saw any message from her that night. Your number, your thread, sent at 1:47 a.m. Chen's voice was hard now. And you're telling us you never saw it? My phone was off. I turned it off after leaving the warehouse because I couldn't handle any more calls or messages. I didn't turn it back on until the next morning. Kale was breathing too fast, his vision narrowing. Check my phone records. You'll see it was off. You'll see I couldn't have received it. Or you saw it and ignored it. Let her die because she'd become a liability. No, that's not... I would never... Prove it. Rodriguez's challenge was simple and devastating. Kale reached for his phone with shaking hands, pulled up his settings, showed them the power logs that documented when the phone had been turned off and on. Look, off at 11:32 p.m., back on at 7:15 a.m. There's no way I could have seen her message. The detectives studied the screen, their expressions unreadable. That doesn't prove you weren't there in person, Chen said finally. Just that you didn't respond via phone. Then check Volkov's surveillance. He was having me followed. There's no way his people lost track of me that night. Convenient, using your enemy to provide your alibi. It's the truth. They sat in silence for a long moment. Kale could feel his pulse in his throat, could taste copper and fear, could hear the fluorescent lights humming overhead like insects. We're going to verify your story, Chen said. And if it checks out, if Volkov's people confirm you were nowhere near Vivian's apartment, then you're clear on this. But Mr. Mercer, you need to understand something. What? You might not have killed Vivienne Laurent, but your actions put her in the position where someone else did. Your cooperation with her, your willingness to use her information, your vendetta against people who don't lose gracefully. Chen stood. You didn't pull the trigger, but you loaded the gun. The words settled over Kael like a burial shroud. Can I go? For now. Don't leave the city. We'll be in touch. Kael walked out of the precinct into morning sunshine that felt obscene given the darkness he'd just sat through. His phone buzzed, a message from an unknown number containing a single line of text. The surveillance footage has been provided to NYPD. You're clear. Don't contact us again. R. Roman had saved him. Again. Not out of mercy or affection, but out of whatever code of ethics governed people who operated in shadows where normal rules didn't apply. Kael stood on the precinct steps, crowds flowing around him like water around a stone, and felt the full weight of what Detective Chen had said. He hadn't killed Vivienne, but he'd created the circumstances that got her killed, had used her desperation and ambition for his own purposes without considering the danger he was putting her in, had been so focused on his own victimhood that he'd never stopped to think about the people he was dragging down with him. His phone rang. His lawyer, a public defender named Jennifer Park, who'd been assigned to his SEC case because he could no longer afford private counsel. Kael, we need to talk. The SEC is offering a plea deal. What kind of deal? 18 months minimum security, full restitution to defrauded investors, permanent ban from securities trading. You plead guilty to 2 counts of securities fraud, they drop the rest. And if I refuse, then we go to trial, which you'll probably lose. And you'll face 5 to 7 years in federal prison instead of 18 months. Jennifer's voice was pragmatic. I know it's not what you want to hear, but this is a good deal given the circumstances. Kael closed his eyes. 18 months. Time to think. Time to figure out who he was without the performance of ambition. Time to pay for what he'd done in a way that was concrete and undeniable. I'll take it. You're sure? You don't want time to think about it? I'm sure. Set up the paperwork. I'll sign whatever needs signing. Okay, I'll be in touch. Kael hung up and started walking. Not toward his apartment. Not toward any destination. Just forward through streets he'd walked 1,000 times when he'd been someone who mattered. When he'd had a future that looked like something other than wreckage. He walked for hours past the office building where Mercer Capital had occupied the 18th floor until the SEC seized everything. Past the restaurant where he'd celebrated his first major deal. Past the luxury gym where he'd networked with other aspiring masters of the universe. All of it meaningless now. All of it revealed as performance rather than substance. By evening, he found himself in Prospect Park watching joggers and dog walkers and families having picnics on the grass. Normal people living normal lives without the constant hunger that had driven him to sacrifice everything for a version of success that had never actually existed. His phone buzzed. A text from Marcus. Heard about the plea deal. For what it's worth, I'm sorry it ended this way. You were brilliant when you wanted to be. You just wanted the wrong things. Kael didn't respond. Another text, this one from a number he didn't recognize. This is Agent Hollis. Your cooperation has been noted. The 18 months will be hard, but you'll survive. And when you get out, you'll have a chance most people don't get. Don't waste it. Kael sat on a park bench as the sun set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that seemed too beautiful for the ugliness of everything he'd lived through. 6 weeks later, Kael stood in federal court wearing an orange jumpsuit and handcuffs, listening to a judge sentence him to 18 months in minimum security federal prison followed by 3 years supervised release. The courtroom was nearly empty. No media circus, no dramatic victim statements, just a bureaucratic processing of consequences that felt almost anticlimactic given the magnitude of destruction that had led here. Marcus was there, sitting in the back row. He didn't meet Kael's eyes. Jennifer Park stood beside him, her expression professionally neutral. Any last words before they transfer you? No. Kael's voice was steady. Let's just get this over with. They let him out through a side door, into a transport van to a facility 3 hours north of the city where the next year and a half of his life would happen in slow motion. Federal prison, even minimum security, was nothing like the movies. No dramatic violence, no gang affiliations, just crushing boredom punctuated by structured routine. Wake at 6, breakfast at 7, work detail or education programs until 4, dinner at 5, recreation until 8, lights out at 10. Kyle was assigned to the prison library, organizing books and helping other inmates with legal research. The irony wasn't lost on him. The man who'd climbed toward financial empires now shelving romance novels and legal briefs for people who'd made mistakes similar to his own. The first month was the hardest. Withdrawal from constant stimulation, constant networking, constant performance. His mind screamed at the absence of challenge, of competition, of the relentless forward motion that had defined his entire adult life. But slowly, painfully slowly, something shifted. He started reading again. Not self-help books about success or biographies of titans. Fiction, poetry, philosophy. The kinds of books Serafina had loved, the kinds he'd dismissed as impractical when there were deals to be made and empires to build. He started writing long letters he never sent to people who wouldn't read them. Marcus, Serafina, his younger self, apologies and confessions and attempts to understand how he'd become someone he didn't recognize. He started talking to other inmates, hearing their stories, learning that everyone here had their own version of the same tale, ambition exceeding ethics, desperation overriding judgment, the belief that rules applied to other people but not to them. And in the quiet moments, lying in his bunk staring at the ceiling or sitting in the yard watching birds fly overhead in patterns that looked like freedom, Cale began to understand something fundamental. He'd spent his entire life trying to become someone worth noticing. And in the process, he'd stopped being anyone worth knowing. The revelation didn't come as lightning bolt clarity. It came as slow accumulation, conversation by conversation, book by book, day by day of living without the constant performance of importance. By month 6, Kyle had stopped counting days until release and started counting days since he'd made a choice he was actually proud of. By month 9, he'd completed 2 college courses, psychology and literature. Not because they'd help his career, but because they helped him understand the wreckage he'd created. By month 12, he'd started facilitating a group for other white-collar offenders, helping them process the shame and anger and profound disorientation of falling from imagined heights. And by month 18, when they finally released him on a gray March morning with a bus ticket and $200 in gate money, Kyle walked out into free air feeling lighter than he had in years. Not because he'd been forgiven, not because the damage had been undone, but because he'd finally stopped running from who he actually was. The world outside had moved on without him. Mercer Capital was a footnote in financial fraud databases. The Blackthorn scandal had been replaced by a dozen newer scandals. Even his own name barely generated search results anymore. He was nobody. And for the first time in his adult life, that felt like relief rather than failure. Kyle took the bus to a halfway house in Queens, where he'd live for the next 6 months while completing his supervised release. Shared kitchen, shared bathroom, curfew at 10 p.m., regular drug tests and meetings with his parole officer. The rules felt comforting rather than restrictive. He got a job at a bookstore in Astoria. Not the one where Serafina had worked. He wasn't that masochistic, but similar enough to feel like poetry of some kind. Minimum wage, no prestige, just shelving books and helping customers and going home at the end of the day without the constant anxiety of maintaining an image. His coworkers didn't know about his past, didn't know he'd once managed hundreds of millions of dollars, or walked red carpets, or convinced himself he was destined for greatness. To them, he was just Kyle, the quiet guy who knew a surprising amount about literature and sometimes recommended books with an intensity that suggested reading had saved his life. Which it had. 6 months after his release, Kyle received a package with no return address. Inside was a single photograph, the one from his wedding day that Serafina had kept. He and Serafina smiling at each other with the kind of hope that only exists before life teaches you how complicated love actually is. Beneath the photo was a handwritten note in Serafina's elegant script. "We were both pretending to be someone else back then. I hope you finally figured out who you actually are. The bookstore suits you better than the hedge fund ever did." S. Kyle held the photograph for a long time, studying the faces of 2 people who no longer existed. Then he placed it in a drawer, not thrown away but not displayed either. a reminder of who he'd been and what he'd lost, and the price of learning those lessons too late to save what mattered. He never responded to the note. Some conversations end without needing final words. A year after his release, Kyle stood on a subway platform during evening rush hour, surrounded by thousands of people all heading somewhere important or meaningless depending on perspective. He'd finished his supervised release, was no longer required to report to anyone or explain his movements, was technically free in every legal sense. But freedom felt different than he'd imagined, not expansive and liberating, just quiet. His phone buzzed, a rare occurrence these days. He pulled it out and saw a message from Marcus. Coffee? Been too long. Cale stared at the message for a long moment, then typed back, Sure, when? Tomorrow. Our old place on Lexington? I'll be there. The next day, Kyle walked into the coffee shop where he'd once met Vivian to receive the forged documents that had accelerated his destruction. The irony of the location wasn't lost on him. Marcus was already there, sitting at a corner table, looking older than Kyle remembered. Grayer. More tired. The kind of exhaustion that comes from surviving rather than thriving. Kyle. Marcus stood, extended his hand. Kale shook it. Marcus. They sat in awkward silence for a moment before Marcus spoke. You look different. Prison will do that. No, I mean you look calmer, like you're not about to explode from internal pressure. Kyle smiled slightly. That's accurate. I rebuilt the firm, Marcus said. Different name, different investors. Completely legitimate operations this time. No shortcuts, no compromises. Good. It's boring as hell compared to what we were doing, but I sleep better. Marcus took a sip of his coffee. I wanted to tell you that, and to say I'm sorry. For what? For not stopping you. When I saw you changing, becoming someone obsessed with winning at any cost, I told myself it wasn't my problem, that you were an adult making your own choices. But we were partners, friends. I should have said something before you crashed. Kyle shook his head. You're not responsible for my choices. I made them knowing they were wrong, justifying them with ambition and fear and 100 other excuses. But they were still my choices. What are you doing now? Working in a bookstore, reading a lot, trying to figure out who I am without the performance. And I'm nobody, just another person trying to get through the day without causing damage. Kyle met Marcus's eyes. Turns out that's harder and more worthwhile than building an empire. Marcus nodded slowly. You sound like someone who's actually learned something. I've had time to think about what matters. Turns out almost nothing I thought was important actually was. They talked for another hour, carefully avoiding the past, focusing instead on books they'd read and places they'd traveled and the small pleasures of life lived without constant ambition. It wasn't the friendship they'd once had, but it was honest in a way that relationship never had been. As they stood to leave, Marcus said, If you ever want to come back, not to finance, but to something meaningful, call me. I could use someone who understands the difference between success and significance. I'll think about it. That's all I'm asking. They parted on the street corner, Marcus heading toward his office, and Kyle heading back to Queens. Back to his efficiency apartment and his bookstore job and his quiet life of reading and reflection and slowly rebuilding something resembling self-respect. 2 years after the gala, where his life had detonated, Kyle received one final message. It came via email from an account he didn't recognize, but the writing was unmistakable. Kyle, Roman and I are in Tokyo for the next 6 months. Business expansion. The Blackthorne-Volkov partnership continues to grow into something neither of us imagined when this started. I'm writing because I heard you're working in a bookstore, that you declined Marcus's offer to return to finance, that you're living quietly and deliberately choosing obscurity over relevance. I'm proud of you. Not because you're successful, by most measures you're not, but because you're honest, because you faced what you did and didn't try to rebuild the same empire that destroyed you. That takes more courage than most people have. I don't know if we'll ever speak again. We probably shouldn't. Too much history, too much pain. But I wanted you to know that somewhere in this world, the woman you once loved is watching from a distance and hoping you find whatever peace looks like for someone like you. We were never meant to survive together, But maybe we both needed to destroy each other to become who we actually are. Take care of yourself. S. Kyle read the email 3 times, then closed his laptop and sat in the darkness of his apartment listening to the sounds of the city, sirens and traffic, and the distant rumble of subway trains carrying people toward futures they couldn't predict. He thought about responding, thought about telling Serafina that he'd finally figured out what she'd known all along, that love without self-knowledge was just performance, and performance eventually exhausted everyone involved. But some messages don't require responses. Some stories end without resolution, leaving only the quiet aftermath of people learning to live with what they've done and who they've become. Kyle stood, walked to his window, and looked out at the Queen's skyline. Not as glamorous as Manhattan, not as impressive as the view from Serafina's penthouse, but real and solid and his. He was 33 years old, had destroyed a career, a marriage, and countless relationships in pursuit of something he'd never clearly defined. Had spent 18 months in prison and 2 years rebuilding from nothing. And somehow, standing in this modest apartment with a minimum wage job and no prospects for greatness, he felt more at peace than he ever had in the marble halls and red carpets of his previous life. The next morning, Kyle walked to work through streets busy with early commuters. He unlocked the bookstore, turned on the lights, and began the quiet ritual of preparing for another day of helping people find stories that might help them understand themselves. A young woman came in around noon, mid-20s, wearing expensive clothes but carrying herself with the exhausted desperation Kyle recognized from his own past. "Can I help you find something?" he asked. "I don't know what I'm looking for." She laughed, the sound brittle. "I just needed to get away from my office for a while. Too much pressure. Too many expectations." Kyle nodded. "I understand. Can I make a recommendation?" "Sure." He led her to the fiction section and pulled out a worn paperback. "Try this. It's about someone who spends years chasing the wrong things and has to learn who they are without all the performance. Might resonate." She took the book, studied the cover, then looked at him with sharp eyes. "You sound like you're speaking from experience." "I am." "Did it work out? The learning who you are part?" Kale smiled, genuinely, without performance or pretense. "I'm still working on it, but I'm closer than I used to be." She bought the book and left, and Kyle returned to his work shelving returns and helping customers navigate the endless possibility of stories. Somewhere across the world, Serafina was building an empire with the man who'd chosen her completely. Somewhere in Manhattan, Marcus was running a legitimate business and sleeping peacefully. Somewhere in memory, Vivienne Laurent existed as a cautionary tale about playing games with people who played for keeps. And here in a Queens bookstore, Kyle Mercer, former hedge fund manager, convicted criminal, failed husband, was learning that redemption wasn't a destination you arrived at. It was a practice you committed to. Every day choosing honesty over ambition, connection over climbing, being present over being important. The work of becoming someone worth knowing rather than someone worth noticing. And though the world would never celebrate that transformation, would never write headlines about the man who learned humility in prison and found peace in obscurity, Kyle was beginning to understand that some victories were meant to be quiet. Some battles were won in moments no one else witnessed. Some empires were built in the space between heartbeats, constructed from better choices and more honest relationships, and the slow accumulation of days lived with integrity. Outside the bookstore window, New York continued its relentless forward motion. Millions of people chasing their own versions of success, their own definitions of meaning, their own catastrophes and redemptions playing out in apartments and offices and street corners across 5 boroughs. Kyle was one of them now. Not special, not exceptional, just human. And after everything he'd sacrificed trying to be more than that, being simply and honestly human felt like the greatest achievement of his life. The afternoon sun streamed through the windows, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air like tiny stars. Kyle picked up another book to shelve and thought about the woman who'd loved him when he was nobody, who'd given him chance after chance to see that being nobody with someone who loved you was everything. He hadn't understood then, but he understood now. And though it was too late to save what they'd had, it wasn't too late to honor the lesson by becoming someone who might deserve that kind of love if it ever came again. The bookstore door chimed as another customer entered. Kyle looked up with a genuine smile and asked the question that had become his daily practice, his meditation, his path towards something resembling peace. Can I help you find what you're looking for? And in the asking, in the simple act of helping someone else navigate their own search for meaning, Kale found what he'd been chasing his entire life without knowing it. Not power, not status, not empire, just purpose. The kind that didn't require recognition or applause or anyone's approval except his own. And that, finally, was enough.